The distress signal burned through subspace like a wound in the void, its pulse ricocheting off the event horizon of dead stars, carried by radiation storms and the silence of forgotten battlefields. It wasn't a request for aid. It was a warning. A flare fired by desperate hands, meant only for those who understood the weight of what it implied. And somewhere beyond the galactic divide, in the heart of human-controlled space, something ancient stirred in response. The fleet was already in motion before the signal reached its intended recipients. Warships blacker than the abyss itself, hulls laced with event-shielding alloys that devoured light, engines silent yet ravenous, folding space into their wake. Each vessel bore the scars of wars that had never been recorded in Dominion archives, conflicts fought in the shadows of collapsing civilizations. The humans had built them for a singular purpose: annihilation. And now, the summons had given them a target. Aboard the dreadnought Ironclad, the command bridge pulsed with the glow of holographic interfaces, data streams flickering in runic symbology not meant for civilian comprehension. The signal's coordinates were a dead system, one that should have been nothing more than a drifting husk in the annals of stellar cartography. But something had changed. Something had returned. Confirmed, came the voice of a tactical officer, his gaze locked onto shifting telemetry. The system's gone dark. All recorded planetary signatures are either missing or altered. A pause, then a darker revelation. And there's something there. Something big. The kind that bends space even at a dead halt. The Admiral's gaze didn't waver. A man who had outlived entire warfronts, who had ordered orbital bombardments that erased civilizations, did not flinch at shadows. Full combat formation. No warnings. If it moves, we burn it. The fleet burned into the system, the gravitational wake of their arrival igniting friction storms in the dense debris field left behind by whatever cataclysm had swallowed the colony. Wreckage drifted in unnatural patterns, too methodical for chance, spiraling around something hidden in the dark. Sensors pulsed outwards, mapping the ruin, searching for survivors. The distress signal still pulsed, faint now, like the heartbeat of something barely clinging to life. Then the shadows moved. Not ships. Not debris. Something else. The warning klaxons screamed a fraction of a second too late. Reality itself fractured, and the first of them stepped through. The first of them stepped through, and the void itself seemed to recoil. Space did not ripple, nor did the fabric of reality tremble as it should have when something emerged, where nothing should be, but instead there was an absence and unraveling of presence itself. The object, or creature, or entity, was tall, elongated in a way that defied humanoid proportions. Its silhouette was jagged, asymmetric, shifting as if perception itself struggled to define its limits. It carried no identifiable propulsion system, no visible armor, no detectable thermal signature, and yet it was there. And then, so were the others. Hundreds. Thousands. Bleeding through space like ink spreading across glass, forming a tide that made no sound, no detectable emissions, no gravitational distortion, only the absence of everything else. The warship's targeting systems flickered, struggling to lock onto them. Every onboard AI model recalibrated, attempting to categorize the threat, but the data collapsed into anomalies. No known form of energy. No standard biological markers. No discernible origin. The Admiral stood rigid, unreadable, but the command crew had already seen the numbers. Every tactical projection led to one certainty: engagement meant destruction. Hostile action confirmed. No attempts at communication. They are moving into an intercept vector. Orders did not need to be given. The fleet had been bred for moments like this, trained in battles where hesitation meant extinction. The ironclad's spinal cannon primed, a fusion-fed singularity charge forming in its core, growing heavier with each passing microsecond. Flanking destroyers deployed fractal torpedoes, their warheads designed to adapt mid-flight, rewriting their internal code to compensate for unknown shielding. Every battle algorithm, every wartime adaptation, every brutal lesson humanity had learned from facing extinction was now compressed into a single devastating response. The first shot fired. A flare of raw stellar energy erupted from the dreadnought's main battery, a luminous spear of annihilation that should have cut through anything. It did not. The instant the shot neared the entity, it did not impact, did not detonate, did not refract. It simply wasn't. As if the space it had occupied had never contained anything at all. The bridge went silent. The Admiral's hand tightened at his side, the only visible reaction to what every soldier present knew: they were facing something beyond their understanding. And then the fleet's proximity alarm screamed. They had closed the distance in an instant. The absent shapes had moved, but no one had seen them move. No transition, no momentum. One moment, they were at range. The next, they were there. The first impact was not kinetic. It was a conceptual strike, a fundamental violation of existence. One of the escort frigates simply ceased, not destroyed. No wreckage, no debris, no cascading explosions of atmosphere. The ship had never been. A just dimensional phasing now. The command came before the horror of the moment could fully settle. The fleet's adaptive shielding flickered, shifting the warships fractionally out of sync with standard reality, creating a buffer of uncertain physics between them and the enemy. But even that was a gamble. They didn't know what they were dealing with, didn't know if phasing would deter whatever had just erased an entire vessel from history. Another frigate vanished, and then another. The battle turned into an impossibility. Weapons fired with no impact. Defenses deployed with no effect. Tactical maneuvers meant nothing. The fleet, engineered to conquer anything in existence, was fighting something that did not acknowledge the rules of war, of physics, of being. And then they spoke. No sound. No transmissions. No signals that could be deciphered by any known means. The words, if they could be called that, were simply known, not in the mind, but in the bones, in the marrow, in the fabric of whatever made a thing real. You were called. You were summoned. You do not understand what you have come to face. The Admiral's breath came slow, steady. We understood enough to come armed. There was no response, only movement. A shifting tide of things, not things, advancing in every direction, folding space with their presence, rewriting the void in patterns the human mind refused to process. Across the command bridge, a voice small but sharp, a scientist rather than a soldier, broke through the chaos. "They're not attacking," the woman said, voice tight with something between fear and revelation. "They're undoing us." The realization hit like a second impact, heavier than the first. This wasn't war. This was not an invasion. This was erasure, removal at a level beyond destruction. And it was spreading. The ironclad systems flickered, not from an EMP, not from cyber warfare, but as if its own reality was being questioned. The Admiral exhaled once, slowly. And then he made a decision. A silent command surged through the fleet's remaining vessels. Every human warship possessed a fail-safe in action so devastating that no enemy, no force in the known universe had ever endured it. Scorched Singularity Protocol. The drive cores in every surviving ship shifted, altering their internal states, collapsing into unstable gravitational wells. The process would take seconds. The result would be catastrophic. Every ship would die, but so would the system. So would whatever stood in its empty spaces. The Admiral's final order pulsed through encrypted subchannels: detonate the fleet. Burn the pathway shut. And as the countdown began, as existence itself trembled in the presence of these impossible things, one of them moved differently. It reached forward, stretching its absence toward the ironclad, and the bridge crew felt the weight of its attention. A shift in its unknowable, unreadable form. And for the first time, the Admiral felt something close to recognition. You are not ready to leave. And the warships began to unburn. The warships should have been gone. The detonations had begun, the singularity collapses primed to devour everything in their wake, but they did not. The burns reversed, the energy unfurled like time running backward, and instead of annihilation, there was reconstruction. Bulkheads knitted themselves from the void. Circuits were formed in delicate strands of impossible light. Weapon systems reassembled with an elegance never engineered by human hands. The ironclad did not return to the state it had been in before it became more. On the bridge, silence stretched, but not from fear. Fear had been surpassed. What took its place was a nameless weight, an understanding that they were now beholden to something beyond destruction, beyond survival. The absence things moved with a purpose that no scan could define, and the Admiral felt his hand relax not from comfort, but from inevitability. A single alert pulsed through the ship's interface. Not a warning, not an error. An invitation. It was not a transmission. It was not a command. It was a pull, a gravitational certainty. And deep within the ironclad's core, something else stirred. Beneath the bridge levels, past the armory sectors and the fusion reservoirs, the ship had always held a vault of chambers sealed under orders older than the Admiral himself, a containment that no engineer aboard had ever been allowed to breach. It had no listed purpose, no records of construction, but now its locks disengaged. The passage leading to it, long, dark, and untouched, now pulsed with a dull, rhythmic hum. A lone figure moved through the dim corridor, his breath shallow. He was not a soldier, not a commander. His duty had never been war. He was a historian, an archivist assigned to the fleet not for battle, but for the knowledge buried within humanity's oldest military assets. His name was known to few aboard, but his presence had always been tolerated because of this room. His footsteps slowed as the vault doors finished their unlocking sequence. He did not touch them. He did not need to. They parted of their own accord, revealing a chamber unlike any other within the ironclad. The air inside was wrong. Not stale, not hostile. The walls were inscribed, not in human language, not in alien script, but in something more primal. Geometric shapes, spirals intersecting with symbols that seemed to shift between glances, as though defying the permanence of written form. At the center stood the object. It was small, featureless, a simple monolith of black material that reflected no light, absorbed all energy that touched it. It had always been there. Even before the ship's commission, before humanity had reached its war-torn apex, this thing had been. But now it was awake. The historian's breath caught. His mind filled with noise, not sound, not voices, but an overwhelming density of information compressed into a single, suffocating instant. He staggered forward, not by choice, but because the chamber allowed nothing else. The monolith pulsed, and suddenly he understood. It was not alien. It was not human. It was both. A relic from the first war that had never been recorded, from an encounter wiped from every history, every archive, every memory. Not forgotten, removed. The monolith had been hidden not to protect humanity, but to protect everything else from humanity. The historian's hands trembled as he reached out. Not to touch, but to witness. And the void answered. The absence things above did not pause in their motion, but a shift occurred, subtle yet vast. Their movements, once flowing like an inevitable tide, now hesitated as though waiting for something. The bridge crew felt it, though none could say how. The Admiral, rigid in his stance, turned his gaze toward the vault's direction, knowing that whatever was happening below was no longer separate from the battle above. And then, for the first time, the absence things spoke again. The lock is failing. The words did not belong to any language. They were a recognition, a statement of absolute certainty. The bridge's main display flickered, and for a single, unbearable instant, every screen aboard the ironclad showed the same image. A world. Not a planet, not a station, something else. A celestial structure, vast beyond comprehension, forged from the same black material as the monolith below. It was not a place that existed within map space. It had never been seen before, yet every soul aboard knew it had always been there, waiting, concealed behind the veil of erased history. And now, it was awake, too. The absence things shifted again. Their attention was no longer on the fleet, no longer on the humans who'd arrived seeking war. Their presence refocused, realigned toward a greater revelation. And at the heart of it, In the vault deep below the ship, the historian remembered. Not from books, not from research, but from something deeper. A memory never lived yet known nonetheless. The first war. The first erasure. The first attempt to end what should not have begun. His fingers hovered over the monolith's surface. It did not glow, did not react, but the air around it tightened. The ship groaned, not from strain, but from recognition. The lock had never been perfect. And now, it was breaking. Above, the admiral issued no orders. None were needed. The fleet was no longer in control of its own existence. The universe had shifted, revealing layers long hidden beneath its fabric, and humanity had stepped into a war it had already fought once before. A final pulse rippled from the monolith. The ironclad systems registered a new destination. Not a location. Not a battlefield. A return. And the fleet began to move. The bridge remained eerily silent as the fleet surged forward. No thruster burns, no transition shock, just movement, dictated by forces beyond human control. The navigation officers stared at their instruments, hands hovering over controls that had become meaningless. The admiral didn't ask for a report. He already knew there wasn't one. "This isn't a jump," one of the officers muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "There's no gravitational slingshot, no hyperspace funnel. We're just being taken," another finished, voice hollow. The absence things remained motionless, their forms suspended in the void like sentinels watching over a process long set into motion. The battlefield no longer existed. The war, the destruction, the careful planning of the Dominion's advance, it had all become irrelevant. The monolith had awakened, and the ironclad had answered. Below decks, the historian's breath came in shallow gasps. The pulse from the monolith had knocked him to his knees, his mind flooded with visions that weren't his own. They weren't memories, not in the way humans understood them. They were imprints, shadows of something greater, something reaching across the fabric of time itself. His fingers still hovered inches above the monolith, his body frozen between instinct and surrender. He could feel them now. Not just the absence things, but something older. A force buried beneath the universe's many layers, coiled and waiting. The monolith wasn't just a key. It was an anchor, a fragment of something far larger, and the moment he touched it, the lock would be broken for good. The ship groaned again, this time deeper, like it was no longer metal but a living thing exhaling after eons of silence. The historian clenched his jaw. "This was never supposed to be opened," he whispered. He wasn't talking to himself. And something answered. A tremor rippled through the chamber, not a quake, not turbulence, but something that made his bones feel misaligned, like the entire concept of existence was momentarily wrong. The symbols on the walls pulsed faster, shifting between shapes too quickly for the human eye to follow. He realized in some cold, detached part of his mind that they weren't written in any language. They were equations, and equations so vast and complex that its mere presence was rewriting reality itself. And the equation was incomplete. Historian. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't alien. It was something else entirely, something woven from the very fabric of causality. The historian squeezed his eyes shut, the pressure behind them building like they were about to burst. "Who are you?" His voice cracked. There was no answer. Only a command. Complete the equation. His hands moved before he could think, before he could resist. His fingers met the monolith's surface, and the universe split. The bridge alarm screamed, not in warning, but in pain. Every screen on the ironclad went black. Every control panel surged with unreadable symbols. The crew flinched as their own bodies reacted, nerve endings firing in ways that didn't make sense, like they were being reprogrammed from the inside out. The admiral clenched his fists. What the hell is happening? No one had an answer. The absence things, for the first time, moved with urgency. They were no longer observers. They were reacting, their formless bodies twisting, reshaping, as if they had been forced into a timeline they had not foreseen. One of them turned, not toward the ironclad, not toward the fleet, towards something else. And then the fleet stopped. Not gradually. Not as if a force had slowed them. One moment they were moving, and the next they simply weren't. There was no inertia, no physics to explain it. They were just elsewhere. The main display flickered back to life. A world loomed before them. The same world from the visions. The celestial structure. The impossible, vast construct that had been erased from history. It pulsed with an ancient, dormant energy, its surface riddled with fractures that looked less like damage and more like something waiting to be unsealed. And then the voice returned. But this time, it was everywhere. You should not have come back. The ship's lights dimmed. The crew felt it in their skulls, in their very cells. The monolith had done more than awaken something old. It had called something back. Something that had once been sealed for a reason. The ship systems convulsed, not in the mechanical sense, but as if something fundamental had been rewritten. The ironclad was built to withstand the worst the Dominion could throw at it: plasma bombardments, hyperspace distortions, neural pulse strikes, but this wasn't a weapon. This was something deeper, something that gnawed at the foundation of the ship's existence itself. The Admiral braced against his console, as a pressure unlike anything he had ever felt settled over the bridge. The absence things had recoiled. Not physically, for they had no bodies in the conventional sense, but their forms rippled in a way that suggested uncertainty, maybe even fear. They were no longer the observers. They were reacting to something beyond their understanding, beyond their reach. The celestial construct looming ahead pulsed again, its fractures widening, revealing an intricate lattice of shifting geometry beneath. There was no logic to its design, no symmetry. It was wrong, not by human standards, not by alien standards, but by the very nature of reality itself. The historian, still connected to the monolith, felt his own mind fracturing under the weight of the knowledge pressing into him. He could see it now. This place, this structure, was not built. It had been grown. The realization sent a tremor down his spine. The Dominion had wiped records of this place, not because they feared it would be found. They feared it would be understood. A new sound echoed through the ship. Not an alarm. Not interference. A pulse. It bypassed every known sense, rippling through the ironclad's crew with a cold certainty that sent their bodies into rebellion. Skin prickled with microscopic static. Vision blurred, flickering between past and present, or perhaps something far worse, something unanchored. One of the officers collapsed, their breath shuddering, eyes locked in a wide, vacant stare. The Admiral's hand hovered over the emergency overrides, but deep down, he knew there was nothing to override. They weren't fighting against a system. They were fighting against something deeper. "We need to break away," one of the bridge officers choked out, voice strained. No one responded. The ship was held. Not by gravity. Not by any force measurable by physics. Something had rewritten the ironclad's state of existence, threading it into the fabric of this place, like an unwilling stitch in a tapestry too vast to perceive. And then the fractures finished opening. The celestial construct was no longer dormant. From within its labyrinthine depths, something stirred. The bridge's main display flickered again, but this time, the data it displayed was wrong. It wasn't coordinates. It wasn't energy readings. It was something else. A language that had no translation. A message that had no sender. The historian wrenched his hand from the monolith, gasping, but the damage was already done. The equation was complete, and the ship's lights died. Not dimmed, not flickered. They ceased. For a moment, there was nothing. No movement. No sound. No sensation. And then they were somewhere else. The bridge consoles flared back to life, but the readings made no sense. They were still on the ship. They were still in the void. But the construct was gone. The absence things were gone. And something new had taken their place. A horizon stretched before them, but it wasn't a planetary surface. It wasn't space. It was something else entirely, an expanse of shifting, molten fractals, bending and unbending, folding into themselves in ways that burned into the mind like an aftermage that refused to fade. Time itself fractured around them. The admiral turned sharply to his officers. "Report." A beat of silence. Then, "There is no location," one of the officers whispered, eyes fixed on the screens. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means," the historian exhaled sharply, sweat beading on his forehead, "we're not anywhere. We've been extracted." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Extracted where? No one had an answer. Because for the first time in human history, they weren't simply lost. They had been removed. The void around the ironclad was wrong. Not silent silence was something the human mind could process. This was an absence of sound in a way that stripped meaning from reality itself. It was a void between voids, a pocket of existence that should not have been, yet here they were. The molten fractals stretched endlessly, warping space into something that fought understanding, twisting itself into a shifting horizon of impossible structures. The admiral steadied himself against the railing, his mind grappling with the raw impossibility of it. The ship's system screamed with errors. Spatial coordinates looped back onto themselves. The engines registered no resistance, no drag, no measurable force. "We're drifting," one of the officers said, voice tight with barely contained dread. Drifting where? There was no point of reference, no gravitational field, no markers in the abyss of what lay beyond. The historian clutched his temples, his breath ragged. "The construct didn't just displace us," he whispered. "It relocated us." "To where?" the admiral demanded. The historian shook his head. "Nowhere. We're outside of conventional space-time." Then the ironclad shuddered. Not from an external force. From something inside. A sound rippled through the bulkheads, something deep, reverberating, not metallic stress, not failing machinery. It was organic. A slow, drawn-out vibration, resonating through the ship's very structure like a distant heartbeat. The crew went still. Then came the whisper. It wasn't spoken. It didn't travel through air or comms. It was in them. A voice that slithered along neural pathways, a murmuring presence that wasn't intrusive, but omnipresent. The historian turned pale. "We're not alone." The lights flickered. The ship's systems hiccuped, struggling against something unseen. The admiral turned sharply to the bridge crew. "Get control of our systems. Now." One of the officers worked furiously at the console, but the interface was lagging, its responses sluggish, as if something was pushing against their input. The whisper grew louder. Then the fractals moved. They had been shifting, warping endlessly, but now they reacted. Something within them turned toward the ship. The molten horizon pulled itself inward, like an eye dilating to focus. The ironclad was no longer an observer in this anomaly. It was noticed. A deep resonance rumbled through the ship, and for a brief moment, the admiral saw something flash across the main display. Not a sensor reading. Not an image. A face. Not human. Not alien in any way he could understand. It was shifting, a collection of layered perceptions, fractal impossibilities stacked upon each other. A presence that wasn't bound by three-dimensional constraints. A presence that saw. And then the ship screamed. Not the crew. Not the officers. The ironclad itself. The bulkheads groaned, the walls flexing as if something unseen was pushing through them. The ship's neural interface convulsed with static, its connection to the crew severed. Something was infiltrating, rewriting, threading itself into the machine's nervous system like a virus beyond the understanding of biology or code. Then, the first officer collapsed. One by one, others followed, eyes rolling back, bodies convulsing as if trapped in a waking nightmare. The historian clutched at his skull, mouth forming silent words, eyes wide with horror. "They're inside us," he gasped. "They're learning." The admiral gritted his teeth. He had fought Dominion fleets. He had outmaneuvered armadas. But there was no strategy for this. No battle formation, no fallback plan. The ship wasn't under attack. It was being consumed. With a snarl, He turned to the surviving officers. We need to sever whatever connection is forming. Now. One of the tech officers, still conscious, struggled against the failing interface. Systems aren't responding. Whatever this is, it's rewriting protocols faster than we can shut them down. Then the whisper returned. Clearer now. More refined. It wasn't just words. It was understanding. It had learned language. And it spoke, "You were never meant to find us." The Admiral's blood turned to ice. The historian staggered forward, hands trembling. This isn't just a place. His voice was hoarse with terror. It's a prison. The presence stirred again, its voice reverberating in a way that made the air feel heavier. We were bound outside of time, cast adrift in the void beyond your understanding. You have become the fracture in our cage. The molten fractals twisted violently, their glow intensifying. The ship trembled as forces beyond comprehension pushed against its existence. The Admiral made a choice. Break us free. The tech officer gave him a look of raw desperation. From what? Whatever's holding us here, sever it, override it, collapse it if you have to. The historian sucked in a sharp breath. You don't understand what you're asking if we sever the connection. We die if we stay. The historian's lips pressed into a thin line. Then he nodded. The tech officer worked frantically, bypassing every security measure, forcing manual overrides that no engineer would dare attempt. The ship groaned under the strain, its systems caught in a brutal tug-of-war. And then, the presence screamed, not in anger, in fear. The fractal horizon convulsed, the impossible geometry folding in on itself. And then the ironclad was falling. Reality snapped. Time shattered. For a brief, excruciating moment, the ship existed in too many places at once. The Admiral saw the past, the future, possibilities, and then darkness. Then, the familiar hum of the ship's core, the weight of gravity, the sensation of being back. The displays flickered. The officers gasped, eyes flickering open one by one. The ship was whole. And then a proximity alarm blared. They were no longer in the anomaly. They were somewhere else. The Admiral turned to the screen, and his breath caught in his throat, because outside the ship, stretching across the void, was a fleet. Not Dominion, not human, something older. And they were waiting.